Happy Tuesday to you. It's Dr. Tammy, and I did a little bit of a questionnaire last night and asked y'all what is gluten and why should you avoid it, and I got a ton of responses. So I wanted to kind of speak to that a little bit. And a lot of people have a lot of opinions on gluten. It's huge, it's a multi-million, maybe even billion-dollar industry, the wheat, the grain industry. So it's kind of interesting how many different thoughts and feelings people get triggered about it. So I want to talk a little bit about what is it, what's the diagnosis, how do you know you have it, and why should you consider avoiding it. So what is it? Well, gluten, I have this nice new whiteboard here. A little hard to see, sorry about that. Gluten is actually two different proteins called gliadin and glutenin that are found in wheat grain. And it's actually the protective protein in there. So when, you know how your grass kind of changes in the wintertime and it kind of dies, it keeps the wheat from dying in the winter, basically. And the word glue comes from the Latin word like glue holding together. So it actually holds the wheat together and it keeps it from kind of breaking apart and being affected by cold weather and destruction and things like that. So the nice thing about those matrices of these proteins, the way they matrix together, it makes them really sticky, and it's wonderful for holding things together. So it's really interesting because things that people always think about gluten and they think about grain. So you can actually extract that gluten and you can use it in the food industry, which the food industry has. And so what they do with that is they use it to hold things together. So I was watching a show with my son, he's 12, and it's called How It's Made. And they were talking about a sausage factory. So they're making sausage, right? Something you would not think has gluten in it. But they were injecting gluten into the sausage as it was coming through the machine, kind of gross, but as it was coming through the machine, and they were packaging it because it made it hold its form. So if you are going gluten-free, you have to read labels because you never know what it's in because they use it in almost everything, which is another problem because one of the things that we do is food sensitivity testing. And people who respond with food sensitivity testing positivity are usually those things, especially the higher responses, the more sensitive you are to something, the more exposure you have to it. So it's kind of like my whole argument with high fructose corn syrup. It's not particularly bad. It's only like 5% different from table sugar, basically. But the fact that it's in everything, right? So they publish those low-fat guidelines and they put sugar in everything. So now we get exposed to sugar all the time, which is very inflammatory. So not so much that it's bad, it's just that it's in everything. So you really have to read labels. So let's talk about the medical diagnosis of if you have a problem with gluten. And how do you know you might have a problem with gluten? Well, everything happens in the gut, right? Food is thy medicine. So if you have any disease in your body, autoimmune disease, or you have chronic disease of any type, you probably have some sort of gut sensitivity, leaky gut. I did a whole video on that, so if you want to go back in my Facebook feeds and look at that, you can. And I'll probably do more on that in the future. But what happens is when you have this sensitivity in the gut to gluten, then you get triggered and the immune system gets triggered. And so then you can have all sorts of autoimmune, which can be autoimmune thyroid, diabetes can be autoimmune, skin, eczema, rashes, psoriasis, you name it, can all be autoimmune type stuff. Arthritis, even some sort of dementias and muscle atrophy diseases and things like that. So all sorts of autoimmune stuff. So it's basically confusion. And what happens is that glutenin molecule looks very similar to many molecules in the body. And so it gets confused. When that gluten leaks into the bloodstream, if you have leaky gut, it gets confused, and so you can start to see thyroid issues and all sorts of problems. So it can be quite significant. How do you know if you have that gluten sensitivity? Well, you can get tested. So we do something called a food sensitivity test. And what we do is we test for IgG, which is an antibody-antigen response, meaning these are your white blood cell antibodies that are a delayed response. They can take up to 3 days to respond. And the problem with cause and effect is if you have an IgE response, like a peanut allergy. You eat a peanut and you immediately swell up and you have to go to the ER for the EpiPen. Excuse me. You know that you have a peanut allergy, right? So we don't even need to do that test. This IgG can take up to 72 hours. So we can test for sensitivity, and the level of sensitivity that you have is rated pretty much like 1 through 3. They have a star system, and then they have a percentage system. So you can see how sensitive you are to gluten. When I first got checked, I was a 3 to gluten. So I had a lot of autoimmune conditions, so I wasn't surprised that I was a 3. So, okay, so there's that. Now, there's also another test that you can do that is a celiac panel. So some people hear about celiac, okay? So celiac means that you have a genetic mutation or a genetic problem with gluten, that when gluten gets exposed to your bloodstream, genetically your body responds with a hyper response. So that could be autoimmune, you could get sick, you could get a stomach ache, you could get inflammation in the gut, irritable bowel, you could get all sorts of autoimmune bowel diseases, Crohn's, all sorts of things. So celiac is actually a genetic problem with gluten. And there's a couple of different tests within what we call a celiac panel that we do. So we usually do some IgA testing, and then we look for antibodies against celiac. So people who have celiac disease are really, really sick usually, and they cannot be exposed to any gluten. So they're the people that are almost fanatical about when they come to your house, they're like, I have to go gluten-free, or they'll bring their own food. And so please honor them, because really it makes them very, very sick. And, for people who don't have that, or maybe just have gluten sensitivity, they don't really understand how sick gluten can make people. So it's really good to be kind and, a little empathetic and understanding when people have a real serious issue with that. So when people have celiac disease, there is very specific blood testing that you can do for that. So that's different between sensitivity to gluten and how sensitive you are, and actually being genetically, you can't touch any gluten at all, or you get really, really sick. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the medical issue that we see. And part of the problem with gluten is that there are other reasons why you may want to avoid gluten. Now, some experts actually say don't avoid gluten until you get tested, because it can affect the testing, because if you don't eat any gluten, then it's not going to show up in the system. But I think, why not? If you're sick and, with Obamacare and insurance and all that, and you don't want to go get tested, why not just try going gluten-free? Now, one of the problems is that when people go gluten-free, there are other things that you can be sensitive to, like dairy, or we have a food panel, an IgG food panel, that we can test for almost 100 or 200 different foods. So kids with ADD, with attention issues, with autism, diabetics, autoimmune, thyroid, all sorts of conditions, arthritis. I usually recommend the larger panels. It just kind of depends. If you're just kind of feeling a little yucky and you think maybe I have a gluten sensitivity, or maybe I have other sensitivities, then you might want to check those. But my point is, if you give up gluten, but you have a really strong dairy sensitivity, and you're still eating a lot of cheese or, milk products, you're not going to feel any better. So you might say, well, I gave up gluten and I didn't feel better. So that's a good reason to go get tested. So I'm going to talk about the 3 reasons you may want to give up gluten. And one of them is because a lot of gluten is found in breads and pastas and things that they make with these wheat grains, which has a lot of carbs or sugar in it. For example, a slice of bread, that's my slice of bread, has about, depending on the slice of bread, 15 to 20 grams of carbs. And most people who have insulin issues that I see for other hormone issues, I try to limit their carbs to 100 grams a day, which is not real strict. Like an Atkins diet, it's usually like 20 grams of carbs a day. So, if people have insulin issues or diabetic, I try to limit them to about 100 grams of carbs a day. So you can imagine that if you had a sandwich, gluten-free or not, but we're talking about like gluten in terms of carbs, then that would be 2 slices of bread, right? There's all your lettuce and stuff on there. So that's times 2. So now we're looking at almost 40 grams of carbs. That's almost half your daily allowance. If you had 2 sandwiches, or you had a sandwich for lunch and a sandwich for dinner, that's your carb allowance almost right there. And then forget it if you had chips or sodas, which I absolutely hate. But you can kind of see that just cutting down gluten can also help you cut out carbs, which is a good thing when you're trying to reduce that sugar intake, because sugar is very, very inflammatory. One other thing I'll say about that is that scientists have found in a couple of different studies that gluten can also be addictive to the brain. There are different molecules within the gluten protein that can trigger opiate receptors in the brain. So gluten may be a reason why you crave bread. Also your insulin, you kind of chase your insulin with blood sugar all day long because you get these insulin spikes. So that's a whole nother reason with the hormones. But there could actually be something about the gluten in these particular carbohydrates that can have an addictive potential in the brain. So they've studied mice and they've kind of found those opiate receptors being triggered. So there's number one reason why you may want to at least decrease gluten in your diet. The number two reason is that gluten triggers, like I said, autoimmune disease. 80% of your immune system is in the gut. So you are what you eat. And if you have a lot of artificial sweeteners, are one of the worst things. So if you drink diet sodas, or you drink the little pink or the blue packets, or you put that in your tea, you can really cause some issues with the permeability in your gut. It completely destroys it. And number three is also going to tie in here with pesticides. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But disrupting the gut barrier then allows the gluten to leak into the bloodstream, which if you have celiac disease or you have that genetic propensity, then you can get really sick with gluten. And then also the gluten is just confusing to the system. So if you have any kind of immune confusion going on, the gluten can trigger that. And I do a whole talk on thyroid where I talk about the thyroid antibodies being triggered by something called zonulin, which is triggered in the leaky gut. So autoimmune, if you have autoimmune conditions, giving up gluten is really, really important. I would also recommend that you get celiac tested and that you get food sensitivity testing if you have any kind of autoimmune disease or you suspect it or you have GI upset or irritable bowel. And then the last reason, number three, is glyphosates. So what the heck is a glyphosate? Glyphosates are pesticides that are found in Roundup. So like Monsanto is absolutely going to hate me for this, but the Monsanto Corporation makes something called Roundup, which you spray on your weeds in your yard. So those glyphosates that are in there actually cause leaky gut. So when you eat the gluten, you can get the leaky gut just from those pesticides. And then when you get the leaky gut, then the gluten leaks into the system and causes the autoimmune response. So it's interesting that they actually saturate the wheat supply with these glyphosates. And then what they do is they genetically modify the wheat so it won't respond to the glyphosates. But you're getting this like double hit of glyphosates because what they do is they saturate the wheat so that it will be kind of wimpy, kind of die just a little bit, but then they genetically modify it so it doesn't die all the way. And then they can get it in the combines much easier. So our wheat supply in the U.S. is very, unless you're getting organic wheat, very dangerous, in my opinion. So anyway, glyphosate is another reason, which also ties into the leaky gut, which then causes the autoimmune disease. So these are three good reasons why you might want to avoid gluten. So I hope that was helpful for you. Come get tested. We have wonderful means to do that. And it's it's just a blood test. It comes back within about 3 weeks, and we can tell you if there's a problem. If you've got kids with allergies, eczema, one of the biggest things that I find with kids with allergies and eczema is this. Dairy allergies and sensitivities as well can be huge, but this can be a big one as well. So I hope that was helpful. Please comment, share this video, share the love. We are working on so many great projects. We are working on a brand new TV show that's going to look completely different, and it's going to have a lot of this exciting, fun stuff with visuals and going out in the community and live audiences. So please stay tuned and please build our fan base. And if you want to be a part of our live audience, please respond as well. Have a wonderful, blessed day, and I'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.